Now, remember, we opened the program by asking the question, why is the cost of living rising? And now we want to talk about the surprise growth in Nigeria's economy.
Cost of living going up, standard of living falling, but there's economic growth.
No, the cost of living rising and economy is also rising.
Okay, anyway, the experts will explain to us what is going on, how that is possible.
Because
that our lives are getting worse, but they say our economy is growing.
The economy, it's just cost of living that is rising. Our life is not getting worse.
If I cannot buy rice to feed my children, if I cannot buy tomato to cook for my children, how is my life getting better?
You are leading me into a conversation that I don't want to have with you in public. Because when we were growing up, I only had rice 3 times a year. Christmas, New Year, and Ileya.
Times have changed.
Okay, anyway. Let's have this. You know, what are we talking about exactly? Nigeria's economy grew 3.46 in the fourth quarter of last year. And that opens a new tab, a similar pace as it did a year earlier. Our data showed on Thursday. GDP grew quicker in the 2 previous quarters of 2023. 2.54% in the third quarter and 2.51% in the second. Growth in the final quarter was 3.52% in annual terms. So the president had said during a November budget speech that the economy was expected to grow by at least 3.76% in 2024. Guess what? The National Bureau of Statistics said full year growth for 2023 stood at 2.74%. Meanwhile, the president is projecting a 3.76% growth in 2024. Let's have conversations with Mr. Charles Iyore, Principal Partner, Dion & Associates Limited, as well as Wilson Erumebo, Guest Lecturer, School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. Both of them join us virtually. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let me begin with you, Mr. Iyore. The surprise economic growth. Okay, let me ask the same question as I asked the first time. Is this also coming as a surprise to you?
Good morning, Mr. Makinde. Good
morning,
Alero. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Growth can have different kind of drivers. It can be either through productivity gains or efficiency gains. I don't have the figures, so I can't speak on behalf of anyone. All I can say for certain is that it is possible that there were some efficiency gains in the system. In other words, the waste that was going on has reduced, but that doesn't stop those who are still in the dark place because the light hasn't reached them from complaining. So it is possible, I don't have the figures, that those gains were efficiency gains. And there might be 1 or 2 indicators to show that. Sense that for a small percentage of society, 3% who are in the civil service or paid employment, now they're getting their salaries in time and they're not being delayed. So that's some measure of slightly very insignificant. But like you said, all of these studies are not laboratory studies, food chemistry, food acid, and they're social studies. They actually need to reflect on the lives of people. What you're saying basically that it reads otherwise in the lives of people. And let's leave it at that. If you have the figures, I don't know whether it's...
okay, just a quick one. Yeah, my apologies. Just a quick follow-up on what you said. Efficiency gains.
Yes.
In what way, manner, shape, or form? Because if we're to say there were efficiency gains, how come they haven't reflected on the lives of the people, as Alera said?
Yeah, like I told you, if we took off the waste that was on petrol, diesel, for example, that means you're spending less money, you're not spending any more money, that's an efficiency gain. How you deploy that efficiency gain is really another matter.
Okay.
And that takes us to a place, what is called enterprise modeling. Because if you don't have an enterprise model, most of those effects will not be reflected as quickly as possible. And I don't think we've ever had an enterprise model for the country since 1960. So without an enterprise model, it's difficult for some of those things to happen when you pull all the levers.
Mr. Rumabo, please, can you just tell us what specific sectors of the Nigerian economy are driving this growth that we're talking about?
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. So I want to make three main points. The first one, relates to your question, and it's good, and the other two are not so good news. So for the first question, for the question you asked, the first point is that oil grew for the first time since 2020. So the oil sector, so we have oil and non-oil GDP. So what we saw in the numbers that the National Bureau of Statistics published is that since the second quarter of 2020, when we had COVID, oil has been showing negative growth consecutively for 14 quarters. So in the fourth quarter of last year was the first time that we saw positive growth from oil. And what that growth was 12%. It's quite huge. And when you then also look at oil production, we saw an average oil production of about 1.55 million barrels per day, as published by the NBS. So it means that that's one of the key areas that growth came from, whilst the non-oil sector grew by just 3%. So when you aggregate that, because again, the non-oil sector has a much larger share of our GDP, it's almost about 96% of our GDP. So 3% non-oil, 12% oil, and then you have 3.4% in overall aggregate growth for the quarter. Now, when you then look at annually, to look at not just the fourth quarter alone, the first, second, third, and fourth quarter, you would see that growth was 2.7%. And it's even much lower than almost all the forecasts that I saw, at the beginning of the year. Many people expected that we will grow at 3%, 3.1%, 3.2%. The federal government was even very optimistic about how about growth rate. But so 2.7% is really quite low.
But what was the basis of the expectations of the federal government at the time, and where do you think we may have gotten it wrong that informed the low growth that you're talking about now?
Yeah, so one thing you would always see, especially when you look at the government forecast in the budget, is that the federal government is always the most optimistic about the economy. Their projections are always very high as far as growth is concerned, and understandably so, because if the government is not optimistic, who else will be about the country? But the question is then, how do we then match our optimism with action? I think that's where we've always falling short.
So collaboration is also lacking, sort of?
Absolutely. So not just even collaboration, I'm even speaking to implementation itself. So you have a budget. Where are your resources going to? What areas are you spending more money on? Are you trying to ensure that you revive the productive sectors of the economy, sectors that have the capacity and potential to create jobs? So one of the things, I'm linking to the first question that Madam Alero, pointed out, is that when you disaggregate growth and where it's coming from, you would see that just about 3 sectors of the economy, contribute almost about 80% or thereabout, even more, to growth that we saw for the full year. So I'm talking about finance, ICT, and agriculture just did about 11% contribution to growth. But finance was 39%, while ICT was about 48%. So you can see that even when you disaggregate growth by the 19 major sectors that we have, you would see that just about only 2 of those sectors are driving growth. So that's why, many a times at the NESG and even some of the works I do, we always emphasize that it's not just about growth in itself. Growth is very important, but we also need to know the sectors that are contributing to that growth. And that's where that link to development, link to employment can then be strengthened. And so when you say growth, for instance, and you're trying to examine how much growth we have and how that links to inflation, you mentioned at the start of the program that we have growth, but then cost of living, inflation is increasing. Yes, both can happen, at the same time. And one of the things is, like I mentioned, if you see that growth is coming from oil, what happened was, the federal government has been trying to stop oil theft, so oil production has marginally increased, in the last couple of months. So that means that it's not so much of a growth that is coming from agriculture or the food supplying sectors. It's growth that is just coming from oil. So you can clearly see that this may not even have that strong impact in terms of reducing inflation. So I think that clarity is needed.
Okay, Mr. Yore, we have this surprise growth, and then we have inflation, which has now reached 29.9, like I said at the beginning. I don't know why we just don't say 30%. So in real terms, what is the benefit of that growth to Nigeria's economy and to the people of Nigeria?
Well, like I said, and like Dr. Rumba has clearly explained, most of these things you're saying cannot happen if you don't have a model that links all of them together. And we don't have a model that links all of them together. And you need to put that model in place and then build on top of it for those effects to take place. And we have never done that since 1960. So let me tell you, for example, if you want to have an enterprise model for the country, you need to know clearly the demographics. So start from the family. And the family demographics is exactly what it is at the very top. You have those who no longer can work, the elderly and the infirm. And then you also have what you call the veterans. Then you have those in the middle who are the ones converting the assets into what you get, people like you and me who are still working. And then you have those who are being trained to replace the working class. Now, if you don't have that clearly, when it is time for you to deploy your Commonwealth, the ratios are inappropriate and those effects cannot be seen. So, and I like to answer those questions, but I don't have all the figures. But it's nice for you to have those tools of analysis. That if all of those three sectors, which exist in your family and in the country, are not at the very first line of enterprise modeling, then you are obviously going to misapply resources. And that needs to take place. And the civil service normally, like in England, would provide the models for the political class to say, if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this will happen. But I believe for a long, long time, the civil service hasn't done that. And I remember one head of service saying, the government wants to make a fool of itself, will help you make a bigger fool of yourself. I guess that's where we are. We've been there since more than 40 years.
All right. Mr. Yore, thank you. Mr. Erumabo, let me come back to you. Now, you wanted to talk about three things the other time. You've only mentioned two. I don't know if you want to talk about those ones as well as, and perhaps they will also answer this question of sustaining this economic growth and making those economic growth realities in people's lives. Mr. Yore talked about the fact that, okay, you have the wins, but you don't deploy it in a way that the people will feel it. So can you help us marry the two so that people can actually appreciate that something is happening?
Very interesting question. So the third point I was going to make actually links to that question you just asked. And the key thing here is that the size of the economy has shrunk, relative to last year. And I say this, and I'm referring to in dollar terms. And I will also say why it's important in dollar terms. So in 2022, Nigeria's GDP was $471 billion, right? 471. In 2023, with the latest figure the NBS released, it's now somewhere around 356 billion.
Wow.
If you decide to do the calculation by, maybe you want to do FX per quarter to divide GDP figures per quarter, at best, you get something close to $380 billion. So we're moving from 471 to 3, to be quite optimistic, let me use $380 billion. So that's a shrunk in the size of Nigeria's economy in dollar terms. And one of the things, key point to also note is that for 2023, Nigeria may no longer be the largest economy in Africa. And this is something we've always known to be, growing up. Nigeria has the largest GDP. And so for the first time in maybe a long time or forever, I don't know, Nigeria may no longer be the largest economy in Africa, especially when we wait for Egypt to publish their GDP figures for the last quarter. Now, why this is important, and this is where I'm going to, is per capita income. So if you then look at Nigeria's per capita income, we're somewhere around $2,000, in 2022, and with these new numbers, we're moving to about $1,700. And the last time we were below $1,700 was in 2006. So, and that's why I said the 2 points I was going to make, the fact that growth is lower annually, 2.7%, and this point that I just made about shrinking per capita income in dollar terms, are not so much good news for Nigeria. Now, linking to your question as to growth and how growth can connect to development, it's not just about growth for one quarter or growth for maybe we have 3.4% in Q4 and we're so excited. The most important thing, and if you look at countries that have lifted people out of poverty, created jobs, one key ingredient is that growth must be high, growth must be consistent, for a long period of time for it to impact the lives of people. It's not about growing up and down and you move. In fact, we've had 2 recessions from 2016 till now.
Mr. Roma, I'm sorry for butting in, but the reason I'm asking this question, right, is because we talk about these growth things like it's something that has to be imported. Now, you talked about the fact that you and Mr. Ire have spoken about the fact that we need to sustain these things and all. I mentioned the issue of collaboration the other time. It is the federal government, as you said the other time, that has the high hopes of, forecasting high figures and all. Is there a carry-along system that would bring in the productivity or not of the states to help that figure, to help the federal government and Nigeria, achieve these high figures and perhaps even surpass it? That's the reason I brought in the issue of collaboration the other time, because unless that happens, I really don't see how we as a nation can grow if we don't have that kind of partnership. How can we, what is there? Do you see a system of collaboration, harmonization of activities between the federal government's ministries, departments, and agencies and those of the states?
I would add even partnerships between federal government, state government, and more importantly, the private sector. That's where jobs are created. That's the engine room of an economy, the private sector. So it's a continuous thing of these 3 agencies. You can add the civil society, for accountability measures, just to ensure, and monitoring and evaluation. All of these stakeholders are important for us to achieve that growth that we desire. Because 2.7% or even 3% is not what Nigeria should be excited about at all. Given the agricultural endowment, given the mineral resources that we have.
I'm glad you talked about
giving people, right, the human resource angle.
I'm glad that you talked about agriculture. So let me take that to Mr. Ire. There was an email we got earlier from a farmer in Jigawa State who is saying that smallholder farmers do not have the capacity to produce enough to export, but that some people have to actually take advantage of the opportunities that they have to get some of these things done. That message came from someone in Jigawa, Mr. Mohammed Awal, a large-scale farmer from Jigawa State, who says businessmen and those corrupt civil servants and politicians, because of EFCC and government fighting corruption, don't take their loot to the bank. They resort to buying up farm products stocking them in warehouses to export? How do we navigate?
Well, like I keep saying, it is very easy to point fingers. So I won't give you an analyst perspective. I'll give you a policy perspective, which is where you always go. Results, answers. You don't want to start telling you figures and all of that stuff. Like I told you clearly, you have to have an enterprise model. Federal government is an enterprise model. State government is an enterprise model. And the local government is an enterprise model. When they follow their models properly, they will set the tone to create the opportunities for the private sector. And I said we haven't done that for a long time. Now let me tell you, I've just told you about the demographics of the house, which is like the demographics of the country. And then I also told you about the deploying of the resources, which is the Commonwealth, in a ratio that makes sure that no part of it is left behind. Now, if you don't have that model, it is difficult for you to do what's called taxation, which is the income tax rate of an individual.
Mr. Yore, if you don't mind, I want you to expatiate, if you don't mind, on what that means. And yes, you might be consulting for the federal and state governments, right, but here is the point that I'm trying to make. Use the analogy of an extended family. I think the example you give, making it a family, is because it's just one nuclear family, father, son, and children and all. But now make it an extended family.
And their fathers and their
exactly
grandparents.
Yeah, exactly. So I want you to make it an extended family. They all live together. A father with many wives, maybe 36 wives, and all of them from different cultures of the world and all of that. So how will that enterprise model work? How does the enterprise model work in a way that collaboration can be there and every one of them can be working towards one vision as dictated by the father in the house?
Now, the father in the house is not the center of the family.
Okay.
The mother in the house is the center of the family because you can track what that one is doing and responsibility. So you do analysis to the family, it is to the mother. Also, the father is just a part of it, and then the grandparents and the children. So that's the way the money is distributed. Now, those who win the election based on their manifesto are given the keys to the treasury, which is our Commonwealth. And that money must be distributed in such a ratio that none of those three sectors I've told you, either in the family unit or the center, can suffer. Now, if you do not do that, it is difficult for you to, first of all, set what's called the income tax rate for the individual, the company tax rate for the company, and to determine where in the industry do you have a windfall profit, which if not taxed, would destroy the industry itself. Now, if you don't have all of these mechanics in place, and then before I start talking about the charities, the churches and the rest of them, how the basis for all of that transaction, you find that you don't have a model that you're driving. And what you're just saying all the time are destination statements, but you can't get nowhere if you don't have a vehicle. And we need to take a very close look at that vehicle so that you can, first of all, be able to set the proper tax rates, like I just told you, and bring all the money in, and determine whether the promise of the central bank to be the counterparty to every transaction is fair or not fair. Now, that was corrected by the Minister for the Coordinating Minister of Economy. He said he felt because of the vagaries and the changes in the currency, the promise to pay at the point of buying petrol is unfair. So they are going to support it by some measure of subsidy. Now, subsidy always seems like it's a difficult, wrong word. It is not a wrong word. What subsidy means is that if you break your leg and somebody puts POP on it, in the hope that when your leg heals, you can begin to walk again. Now, but if that's appropriate use of the subsidy, but if you're using it to cover inefficiencies in the system, then you're hiding to nowhere. And if you don't have for 40 years, you can have another. So basically, you must go back to brass tacks. You must begin to look at why did we make this mistake and how long ago. I begin to correct from the very beginning. Now, if you ask me to take it even further, 4 years after or 5 years after independence, the fact that the politicians wanted to burn themselves down, self-immolation, somebody needed to come in to correct it. Okay, the enemy has corrected it. But in that process, it stopped the legislative arm of government, which is actually holds the keys to the treasury. And that has been the case for a very, very, very long time. Now, what that army period did was to make sure that it took away your voice and muted your reasoning. Now, if you go back to civilian rule, which is what you have, and you don't open up that voice and generate that reasoning, you'll be on a hiding to nowhere, which is what we're seeing now. In fact, the internet is perhaps the best reflection of it, where you see some of that voice has been opened up, has been released, but the reasoning is still not there. You need to go back to that model, like I've told you. Families have their own models and working very well with it. Local government needs to have a model. State government needs to have a model. Federal government needs to have a model. And when these models work, then you can match the competition. What we're talking about here is in a world, it's a very competitive world. We can't afford to be doing things as if willy-nilly we're in charge and then just make announcements all the time. So I'll not do figures with you and analysis with you. I like what you're saying, Makinde. Stick to the policy perspective. What do we do to achieve results? Go back to the drawing board and build an enterprise model. Thank you.
Mr. Erumubo, when you were talking the other time, you mentioned the importance of the private sector in growing the economy. I think you called it the engine room of the economy, or you used some such expression. But I want to ask you, the private sector in Nigeria, they have all kinds of issues, let me say. And among those issues is the issue of them having to pay, I think it was 38 different taxes that they said to us once when they were our guests in the studio. I mean, so how much do you see our economy growing and growing faster if our dependence is on a private sector that does not seem to be growing much because the enabling environment doesn't seem to be there for that sector to grow?
Yes, it's interesting that you made this point because I also, I've been associated as a senior fellow with the Faith Institute, and I also led in producing reports on taxation just last year, November. And we also presented to the committee, the Fiscal Policy Committee on Taxation, headed by Mr. Taiwo Oyedele. We presented to one of the subcommittees. And it highlights how important taxation is and how it needs to be addressed, especially from the angle of multiple taxation. So what you find is that it's one of the key factors. So in almost all the surveys, if you go through the State of Entrepreneurship reports that the Faith Foundation releases every year, you would see that multiple taxation is always among the top 5 problems that businesses cite. In some cases, it's number 3. In some years, it will be number 2, and all that. And what you then find is that there are cases where, in fact, at the last conference, one of the business owners, MSME owners, she mentioned that tax officials would come to her shop and demand for all kinds of taxes. And when she complained that these taxes are just too much for one person to pay, they told her, if you like, close your shop. Another person will come and rent this shop and continue to pay the taxes. So that is the mindset from the people who are assigned to collect taxes. In some sectors, like those that operate in the logistics sector, it's one of the most affected. So it came up as, I think about 60% of businesses in that sector said multiple taxes was one of the biggest problems they faced, because again, they move from one point to another, delivering goods from one state to another. In fact, some of them said you would be in a particular state and then they'll be asking you for taxes paid in another state. You have to show the receipt, So it's one of the most, daring problems. And I'm very excited, hopeful that this, the Fiscal Policy Committee, I've been seeing what they've been doing, on taxes, trying to harmonize the taxes. My argument is that all of the main reform for taxes rely in the states. It's the state government that can make that effort. So there was some movement by international institutions some years ago for states to consolidate their tax laws. And what most of them did was to put together all their tax laws, tax policies. So many of the states have that consolidation of tax laws. But what you find is when you go into that, when you download that document from whether their website or wherever, you would see that the multiple tax problem is still there. So what they just did was to put all of the different laws together into one, and then they still retain that problem of, you have to pay this, pay that every year. So what the key recommendation here is that how can you harmonize all of these taxes into one? So I'm currently living, in the UK now at the moment. And what you do is once you pay your council tax, that's all you need to do as a citizen, for instance. Once you pay that, it goes to the local council. They then decide what they want to do with it, whether it's to do street lights, whether it's to do road, whether it's to do whatever local needs that you have. They decide how to share it. So it's not a case where A will come, B will come, C will come, and at the end of the day, it affects your productivity because businesses are already dealing with too many multiple problems, from FX to payment of salary to growing your business, and then adding the tax bottleneck is a big problem. So my argument is harmonize those taxes. In the tax law, you still have things like bicycle fee, wheelbarrow fee. These are things that were done decades ago.
I think perhaps a good way to go about it would be to amend the constitution and remove some of them. Because some of them are actually very there. You need constitution, not just some laws.
Tax.
Not just, you are absolutely right. So the constitution and even the laws within the states, because if you go through the Tax Act, for instance, the one that, was reviewed by Okonjo, and at some point, you would see things, frivolous things that you wonder what are these things and why are we still charging businesses to pay these things?
Yeah, well, we could go on and on, Mr. Rumabo, but at least now people have some kind of ideas about all of these things. Let me take the last words of Mr. Iyore, because I know I'm almost certain, I think I have an idea what he's going to say, but your parting shot.
Well, like I think I've been trying to explain to you what an enterprise model is. A clear example is how America, in less than 80 years, beat an old and aging Europe to production in less than 80 years. Was basically because of the enterprise models. Whereas a family would build a Mercedes, a Rolls Royce, and the rest of it, the Americans put all the components apart. And those small businesses who you see produce those components that were assembled. So it's nice to build an MSME, but if you don't raise those big merchants that know how to add value to the system, you really cannot grow the economy.
Absolutely.
And with merchants we now have are in the service sector, they're in the banking sector, they're defense of government.
All right.
And quite honestly, they don't know what it is to add value to the system.
I think I almost said it that we want to pass close with the enterprise model, but I think let me just hope that someone has listened to you enough to know, okay, perhaps this is actually the way to go. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. Charles Iyore is principal partner, Dion and Associates Limited, as well as Wilson Nerumebo, guest lecturer, School of Oriental and African Studies. Both of them joined us from the UK virtually. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, much ado about education. Well, that's it. Our next conversation. Just stay with us.